A nurse fell in love with an enemy soldier and paid the price for it. WW2. In a world at war, their love became the greatest act of rebellion. Chapter 1. The Blood and the Rain. The autumn of 1944 had bled all the colour from Normandy, leaving behind a palette of grey skies, brown mud, and the grim crimson that stained the canvas tents of the 88th Evacuation Hospital. Rain, a relentless, miserable drizzle, had been falling for 3 days. It turned the camp into a quagmire, the sucking sound of boots in the thick mud, a constant rhythm beneath the distant, percussive heartbeat of artillery. Inside Tent C, the air was thick with the smells of antiseptic, sweat, and despair. Lieutenant Eleanor Vance, her auburn hair pinned tightly beneath her nurse's cap, moved with an economy of motion born from months of relentless work. At 24, the idealistic Ohio farm girl, who had enlisted to do her part, had been replaced by a woman whose eyes held the weary wisdom of someone who had seen too much. The romantic notions of Florence Nightingale had long been washed away by the tide of broken bodies she tended to day and night. "Vance, we've got another jeep load coming in," called Major Davis, his voice a gravelly rasp that cut through the cacophony of groans and quiet whimpers. "Ambulance took a hit on the road from St. Lo. A few of ours and one of theirs." Ellie nodded, wiping her hands on an already soiled apron. Of ours meant American boys, faces young and terrified, who reminded her of her younger brother back home. Of theirs meant the enemy, a German. They were usually met with a cold professional indifference, patched up just enough to be shipped to a POW camp. They were a problem to be processed, not a person to be saved. The tent flaps were thrown open, letting in a gust of damp, cold air that made the wounded shiver under their thin wool blankets. 2 corpsmen carried in a stretcher, their movements strained. On it lay an American soldier, his leg a mangled ruin. Ellie and another nurse, Sarah, were on him instantly, a flurry of practiced hands applying pressure, administering morphine, their voices calm and reassuring even as their minds catalogued the horrific damage. Then came the second stretcher. The man on it wore the mud-caked field-grey uniform of the Wehrmacht. He was unconscious, his face deathly pale beneath a mat of dirty blonde hair. A large, bloody patch was spreading across his abdomen. "Just put him in the corner," Davis grunted, barely glancing over. "We'll get to him when we can, prioritize our boys." But they were short-staffed, and the other nurses were already overwhelmed. Ellie had just finished stabilizing her patient, handing him off to a surgeon's assistant. Her eyes fell on the German soldier, left alone in the corner. A low, pained sound escaped his lips. It wasn't the sound of an enemy. It was the universal sound of agony. Her creed, the one that had been drilled into her, to provide care for any sick and wounded, warred with the hardened reality of the front line. "Major," Ellie said, her voice steady, "I have a moment." Davis shot her a sharp look, his exhaustion etched into the deep lines on his face. "He's a Kraut, Vance." "He's also a dying man, sir," she replied, her gaze unwavering. 5 minutes to see if he can be stabilized won't cost one of our men his life." For a long moment, Davis just stared at her. Then he gave a curt, dismissive wave. "Fine. Don't waste too much morphine." Ellie knelt beside the stretcher. The mud on his uniform was mixed with so much blood it was almost black. She carefully cut away the fabric around the wound. Shrapnel, deep and ugly. He was young, probably her age. His features were fine, almost scholarly, not the brutish caricature from the propaganda posters. As she began to clean the wound, his body tensed and his eyes fluttered open. They were a startling, clear blue, now clouded with pain and confusion. He looked at her American uniform, and a flicker of fear crossed his face. "Ruhig," she said softly, using one of the few German words she knew. "Quiet. Ich bin eine Krankenschwester. I am a nurse." His breathing was shallow, his lips chapped and pale. He tried to speak, but only a hoarse whisper came out. She leaned closer, her ear near his mouth, the smell of rain and earth clinging to him. "Wasser," he rasped. "Water." She nodded, grabbing her canteen and dampening a piece of gauze. As she gently touched it to his lips, their eyes met again. In that moment, the world outside the small bubble of their space fell away. The rain, the cannons, the groans of other men. She saw no uniform, no enemy, only a human being clinging to life. And in his blue eyes she saw a flicker of something that looked devastatingly like gratitude. To Chapter 2. Whispers in the gloom days bled into one another, each marked not by the sun, but by the shifting tides of casualties. The German soldier, whose papers identified him as Klaus Richter, defied expectations. He survived the night, and then the next. The surgeon had removed the shrapnel, but an infection had set in, leaving him in a state of perpetual fevered delirium. He was too weak to be moved to the POW camp, a piece of administrative inconvenience left in Tent C's forgotten corner. For Ellie, he became a quiet focal point in the relentless chaos. During her long shifts, she found herself drifting to his cot, checking his bandages, cooling his brow with a damp cloth. The other nurses mostly ignored him. Sarah, Ellie's closest friend in the unit, watched with a concerned frown. "You're spending a lot of time on that one," Sarah commented one evening as they shared a cup of tepid coffee. The generator hummed, casting long, dancing shadows across the tent. "He has no one else," Ellie said simply, her gaze fixed on Klaus's still form. "That's the point, Ellie. He's not one of us," Sarah warned, her voice low. "It's one thing to do your duty. It's another to adopt him. People notice things around here." Ellie knew Sarah was right. Fraternization was a serious offense. But what was she doing, truly? She was keeping a man alive. It felt less like a crime and more like the very definition of her job. A week after he was brought in, Klaus's fever broke. That night, as Ellie was doing her final rounds, she found him awake. His blue eyes were lucid, watching her as she approached. "The nurse," he said, his voice weak but clear. His English was precise, with only a faint melodic accent. "You speak German?" "Only a few words," she admitted, checking his pulse. It was steadier. "My grandmother was from Pennsylvania Dutch country. I picked some up." "You saved my life," he stated, not as a question but as a fact. "The surgeon saved your life. I just changed your bandages." She tried to keep her tone professional, distant, but his intense gaze made it difficult. "No, you stayed," he insisted softly. "I remember a voice in the dark." A blush crept up Ellie's neck. She had spoken to him during his delirium, quiet words of comfort she thought he'd never hear, the way she would to any scared boy so far from home. Their conversations began like that, in hushed tones during the dead of night when the rest of the tent was asleep or lost in a morphine haze. They were brief, fragmented, but they were a lifeline for them both. He told her he was a student from Heidelberg, drafted 3 years ago. He loved poetry. Rilke in German, Keats in English. He had never wanted to be a soldier. "I was taught that men like you were monsters," she confessed one night, while changing the dressing on his wound. He managed a weak, sad smile. "I was taught that Americans were decadent capitalists who had lost their souls, and yet here you are, an angel in a starched white cap." She laughed quietly, the sound foreign and fragile in the grim tent. She started to see the man, not the uniform. His dry wit, the sadness in his eyes that spoke of a deep weariness with the war, the way he would thank her for the smallest kindness, an extra blanket, a spoonful of broth, as if it were a gift from the heavens. She began taking small risks. She would slip him a piece of chocolate from a care package, hiding it in her palm. When his fever returned one night, she sat on the floor by his cot long after her shift ended, reading from a worn book of Walt Whitman poems she kept in her pocket, her voice a low murmur that she hoped would soothe his troubled sleep. "Ellie, what are you doing?" Sarah's sharp whisper cut through the night. She was standing at the end of the aisle, her arms crossed. "Major Davis is doing a walkthrough. Get away from there." Ellie's heart leaped into her throat. She scrambled to her feet, her face burning with guilt and fear. She had been so lost in the quiet moment, in the rhythm of the words and the sound of Klaus's soft breathing, that she had forgotten where she was. She had forgotten the rules. She scurried away, her mind racing. Sarah's warning wasn't just friendly advice, it was a lifeline. She was becoming careless. As she straightened bedsheets on the other side of the tent, feigning work, she glanced back. Klaus's eyes were open, following her. He looked from her to Sarah, and a look of profound understanding and sorrow passed over his face. He knew, as she did, that the fragile peace they had built in the shadows was in danger of being shattered by the harsh light of war. Chapter 3. A line of poetry. Sarah's warning echoed in Ellie's mind long after her friend had returned to her bunk. The fear was a cold knot in her stomach. She wasn't naive. She knew the rules. Fraternizing with the enemy was an act of treason in the eyes of the military brass. It undermined morale, broke down the essential barrier between us and them that made this brutal war possible. But every time she looked at Klaus, she didn't see a faceless enemy. She saw the man who loved Rilke and spoke of the rolling hills of Heidelberg with a profound, homesick sadness. For the next few days, Ellie was a model of professional detachment. She tended to Klaus's needs efficiently, her movements crisp, her words limited to medical necessities. She avoided his eyes, fearing that even a shared glance would betray the depth of what was growing between them. She could feel his confusion, a silent question in the way he watched her move through the tent. The distance was a physical ache in her chest, a heavier burden than the exhaustion from her double shifts. Major Davis seemed to be watching her more closely. He would often stop by Klaus's cot during his rounds, his expression unreadable as he checked the chart. "Still with us, is he?" he'd grumble, more to himself than to Ellie. "Tougher than he looks." Each comment felt like a subtle probe, a test of her composure. The nightly conversations ceased, replaced by a tense, suffocating silence. The small world they had built in the gloom was collapsing. Ellie felt a desperate need to let him know that her caution was born of fear, not a change of heart. But he wasn't alone. The idea came to her as she was organizing a new shipment of medical supplies. Paper, a small, sterile sheet from a memo pad. The risk was enormous. A written note was tangible proof, a piece of evidence that could condemn her, but the silence was more unbearable than the fear. That night, she waited until the tent was steeped in the heavy breathing of sleep. By the dim light of a single hurricane lamp, she wrote a simple question on the small piece of paper. "Are you all right?" It seemed so inadequate, so small, but it was all she dared to write. The next morning, during her routine check, her hands trembled as she took his temperature. As she leaned in to adjust his pillow, she slipped the folded note into his palm, her fingers brushing his for a fleeting second. His hand closed around it, a silent, warm confirmation. He didn't look at her, but she saw the muscle in his jaw tense. For the rest of the day she was on edge, her stomach churning with anxiety. She imagined all the ways it could go wrong. A corpsman finding the note, Klaus being searched, Davis discovering it during his rounds. When her shift finally ended, she was emotionally drained. As she was about to leave the tent, Sarah stopped her, pressing a small, folded piece of paper into her hand. "He asked me to give this to you," Sarah whispered, her eyes full of a troubled mixture of loyalty and fear. "Ellie, for God's sake, be careful." Ellie fled to the privacy of the nurse's quarters, a cramped, damp space that offered little comfort, but at least shielded her from prying eyes. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she unfolded the note. It wasn't a reply to her question. It was a single line of German, written in a weak but steady hand. "Das ist die Sehnsucht. Wohnen im Gewoge und keine Heimat haben in der Zeit." She didn't need to translate it. She knew the Rilke poem by heart from her college literature classes. That is longing, to live in the swell and have no home in time. Tears welled in her eyes, hot and sudden. It was more than a line of poetry. It was a confession. It was his soul laid bare. He was telling her that he too was adrift, a man without a home in this violent, unforgiving time. And in that shared homelessness, in that mutual longing, he was saying he had found a kindred spirit in her. The small piece of paper in her hand was no longer a risk. It was a promise, a beautiful, terrible promise that would force her to choose between her duty and her heart. Chapter 4. The sound of a boot on gravel. Klaus was getting stronger. The color was returning to his cheeks, and the deep-set weariness in his eyes was occasionally replaced by a spark of his old self. His physical recovery was a testament to the care he had received, but for Ellie, it was a death knell. A healthier prisoner was a prisoner ready for transfer. The day she had been dreading arrived with a casual morning announcement from Major Davis. "The kraut in the corner is being moved out tomorrow at 600, he said during the morning briefing, not even looking in Ellie's direction. "He's well enough to join the other POWs at the transit camp. Make sure his papers are in order, Vance." The words hit Ellie like a physical blow. Tomorrow. She had one more night. A wave of panic and desperation washed over her. All she could think about were the things left unsaid, the conversations they would never have. The thought of him disappearing behind barbed wire, becoming just another faceless number in the vast machine of war, was unbearable. She had to see him, to speak with him one last time, away from the watchful eyes and listening ears of the tent. That night, she made a reckless plan. After her shift ended, she waited in the shadows behind the supply tent, her nurse's cape pulled tightly around her against the biting November wind. The rain had finally stopped, and a sliver of a pale moon hung in the broken clouds, casting a weak ethereal light over the muddy camp. She had convinced a young corpsman, a boy from her hometown who owed her a favor, to tell Klaus to meet her. "Just tell him I need to give him final instructions about his wound care for the transfer," she had lied, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Every sound, the distant rumble of a truck, the shout of a guard, made her jump. Finally, she saw a figure emerge from the shadows of Tent C, moving slowly, cautiously. It was him. He was wearing standard-issue prisoner fatigues, the grey material making him seem anonymous, but she would have known his silhouette anywhere. "Eleanor?" He breathed her name as he reached her, the first time he had ever used it. "Klaus," she replied, her voice trembling. "I'm so sorry. I had to see you." "To say goodbye?" The sadness in his voice was a raw, open wound. "I don't know how to," she confessed, her carefully constructed composure crumbling. "This all feels impossible." He reached out, his hand hovering for a moment before he gently touched her arm. The rough wool of her cape was a thin barrier between them. "In another life, maybe," he said softly. "I would have liked to have met you in Heidelberg. I would have shown you the old bridge and read poetry to you by the river. Not in a place like this." Tears streamed down her face, cold on her wind-chapped skin. "Klaus, She didn't know what to say, that she was falling in love with him, that she was terrified for him, that she was a fool for risking everything for a few stolen moments. He stepped closer, his gaze intense. "What you did. You saw a man, not a uniform. You reminded me that I was one. Do not ever think that was nothing." She raised her hand to his cheek, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. In that moment, the war, the camp, the entire world fell away. There was only the two of them. Two lost souls who had found a home in each other, however temporary, however doomed. He leaned in, and she knew he was going to kiss her. A sharp, sudden sound cut through the night, the crunch of a heavy boot on gravel just a few yards away. They sprang apart, their hearts seizing with terror. A powerful beam of light sliced through the darkness, pinning them in its white glare. Ellie threw a hand up to shield her eyes, her breath catching in her throat. "Well, well, Vance," a cold, familiar voice drawled. "What do we have here?" Major Davis stood there, his face a mask of cold fury in the harsh light of his flashlight. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. His voice was quiet, seething with a rage and disappointment that was far more terrifying than any outburst. "Get the prisoner back to his tent," he ordered a guard who had appeared silently behind him. "And, Lieutenant Vance, you are to consider yourself confined to your quarters. You and I will have a long talk in the morning." As two guards roughly grabbed Klaus's arms and dragged him away, his eyes locked with Ellie's one last time. They were filled with fear, not for himself, but for her. She stood frozen, bathed in the merciless beam of the flashlight, the cold reality of her actions crashing down on her. The price for her compassion, for her love, was finally coming due. Chapter 5. No Home in Time. The inside of Major Davis's administrative tent was cold and stark. A single bare bulb hung from the central pole, casting a harsh, unforgiving light on the clutter of maps and paperwork spread across his makeshift desk. He didn't offer Ellie a seat. He stood opposite her, his hands clasped behind his back, his face a mask of stone. The fury from the night before had cooled into something far more chilling, a quiet, profound disappointment. "I read your file this morning, Lieutenant Vance," he began, his voice low and even. "Ohio, top of your class. Commendations for your work during the push after D-Day. You were one of my best nurses, one of my most reliable." Ellie stood ramrod straight, her gaze fixed on a point just over his shoulder. She said nothing. There were no excuses to be made, no justifications that would sound like anything other than treason. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" he continued, his voice hardening. "This isn't a game. That man is the enemy. He and his comrades are the reason those boys are lying in your tent, screaming in the night. Your actions undermine the very discipline that holds this army together. What you did is called fraternization. In wartime, that's a pretty word for treason." "Sir," she finally whispered, her voice hoarse, "my intention was never—" "I don't care about your intentions," he snapped, his control finally breaking. He slammed his hand on the desk, making a stack of papers jump. "I care about the consequences. I could have you court-martialed. I could see you stripped of your rank, dishonorably discharged and sent home in disgrace. Do you understand that?" "Yes, sir," she said, her body trembling slightly. He stared at her for a long, silent moment, the anger in his eyes warring with a deep-seated weariness. "But a court-martial would be a scandal," he said, more to himself than to her. "A mess we don't have time for. And God help us, we are still short on nurses." He let out a long, heavy sigh and walked to the tent flap, pulling it aside to look out at the grey morning light. "The prisoner, Richter, was transferred an hour ago. You will not see him again. As for you, Lieutenant, your service with the 88th Evacuation Hospital is over." The words, though expected, landed with the force of a physical blow. "I've arranged for your immediate transfer," he said, turning back to face her. "You're being reassigned to the 120th Station Hospital near Cherbourg. It's a supply depot. You'll be checking inventory, tending to logistics staff with common colds. You will be far from the front, far from any position where your compassion can compromise this unit again. A permanent black mark will be placed on your service record. You'll finish your tour in obscurity, and then you'll go home. Be grateful, that's all it is." He dismissed her with a wave of his hand, already turning back to his desk. His message was clear. She was no longer his concern. Numbly, Ellie walked back to her quarters. The news had already spread. The other nurses averted their eyes, their silence a wall of judgment and fear. Only Sarah was there, waiting by her bunk, her face etched with sorrow. She didn't say, "I told you so." She simply began to help Ellie pack her small duffel bag. "They took him before dawn," Sarah said quietly, folding one of Ellie's uniforms. He asked me to tell you to be brave." Ellie choked back a sob, pressing her knuckles to her lips. Brave. How could she be brave when her entire world had been shattered? An hour later, a jeep was waiting for her. As she climbed into the back, she looked at the rows of canvas tents, at the mud and the misery that had been her home. This place had taken everything from her, her innocence, her reputation, her future, and yet it had also given her something precious and unbearable, a few stolen weeks of a love that felt more real than the war itself. As the jeep rumbled down the muddy track, leaving the 88th behind, Ellie pulled the worn book of Whitman poems from her pocket. She didn't open it, she just held it, the pages a fragile shield against the cold. Her career was in ruins, and the man she loved was gone, perhaps forever. She would never know if he made it back to Heidelberg, if he ever read poetry by the river again. The jeep turned onto the main road, and the camp disappeared from view. The grey Norman sky stretched out before her, vast and indifferent. She thought of the line of poetry Klaus had written, the words now seared into her memory. Das ist die Sehnsucht. Wohnen im Gewoge und keine Heimat haben in der Zeit. She had paid the price. She had lost her place, her purpose. But in the swell of the war, in the heart of the chaos, she and a German soldier had, for a brief, fleeting moment, found a home in time. And as she faced the lonely, uncertain future, she knew that the memory of that home, however impossible and costly, would be the one thing they could never take from her.